On the southern plains of ancient Hellas, where harsh, rocky hills met the parching winds, lay a city whose fears differed from all others. Its inhabitants did not tremble at the prospect of defeat in battle, their true terror was weakness, whether internal or external. This unique philosophy permeated every facet of their existence, shaping a society unlike any other. Unlike their neighbors, who strove for architectural grandeur, immortalization in epic poems, or the development of profound philosophical schools, this city chose a different, singular path. Its streets were not adorned with opulent temples dedicated to numerous gods, nor did inspiring verses celebrating heroic deeds resound there, and its squares were not filled with inquisitive minds engaged in endless dialogues. Instead, every aspect of life was subjugated to a single, all-encompassing goal, the upbringing of invincible warriors. From birth to their last breath, every individual here became part of a grand machine, honed to perfection, designed for one purpose alone, eternal readiness for combat. The name of this legendary city was Sparta. We will explore why Sparta attained the status not merely of a polis, but of a true legend. The reader will learn about its birth from a blend of ancient myths, bloody conquests, and the fateful reforms of Lycurgus, and how young boys were transformed into unyielding hoplites, passing through a crucible of pain, cold, and harsh silence. The secret of how an army, devoid of gold, became the embodiment of Hellenic might will be revealed, and why, at the very heart of the Spartan system, there was no room for doubt, only an unshakable sense of duty. Attention will be paid to the Peloponnesian War, where Sparta and Athens clashed not only for hegemony but also for the right to be the true voice of Hellas. The story of the Battle of Leuctra, the day the Spartan phalanx wavered for the first time, will be told, as will the final attempts to revive past glory and how Sparta transformed from a specific polis into a universal symbol of austerity, strength, and unyielding resolve. And, of course, the history of the legendary 300 warriors, whose memory outlived the state itself, will not be overlooked. On the southern plains of the Peloponnese, amidst majestic mountain ranges and shady olive groves, along the banks of the slow and murky Eurotas River, lay Laconia. This land, harsh and not particularly fertile, possessed a special, almost mystical grandeur. It was here, among stones and rocks, that the phenomenon later known as Sparta was born, not just a city, but a powerful idea, an enduring image permeated with myths. This was a place where true values lay not in wealth, refined arts, or commercial achievements, but in the strictest discipline, unshakable restraint, and unconditional fulfillment of duty. Ancient Greek legends say that Lacedaemon, son of Zeus, gave this land his name. However, the true history of Sparta began much later, with the arrival of the Dorians in the southern Peloponnese. It was an invasion marked by fire and blood, followed by the ruthless subjugation of the indigenous Achaean tribes. The Dorians were not the first to set foot on these lands, but they were destined to remain here forever. They did not merely conquer Laconia, they completely reinterpreted its essence. Among the subjugated settlements was an ancient village located at the foot of Mount Taygetus. It consisted of 4 villages, and their unification marked the beginning of the polis of Sparta. This city was not a city in the usual sense, it had no defensive walls. The citizens of Sparta themselves declared, "Walls will not protect those who cannot protect themselves." Sparta's defense lay in its people. To forge a unified state from this disparate community, more than just a conqueror was needed, a true lawgiver was required. This person was Lycurgus, a semi-mythical reformer whose presence is forever shrouded in mystery. No one can precisely determine the period of his life. Some sources claim he was a contemporary of Homer, others that his rule preceded the poet's era. However, what is attributed to him irrevocably shaped Sparta into what it has been known as for centuries. Legend has it that Lycurgus traveled the world, studying the laws of Crete, Egypt, and Ionia. He returned to Sparta with a single purpose, to rescue it from a state of chaos. Gathering the people, he proclaimed, "Henceforth, Sparta shall live by new laws, the retra." These laws concerned everything, from the state structure to dietary rules and methods of child-rearing. Lycurgus established equality among citizens, or at least its outward semblance. Each warrior was allocated an equal plot of land, which was cultivated by helots, the disenfranchised serfs. All gold and silver were confiscated, only iron bars, inconvenient for storage and exchange, remained in circulation, serving to eradicate the love of luxury. He created the Gerousia, Council of Elders, and the Appella, Popular Assembly, which, however, never held a decisive vote. Power in Sparta was distributed between two kings, an unusual arrangement even for Greece. Two kings from two different dynasties ruled simultaneously to balance each other, one led the army, the other managed internal order. Thus, Sparta sought to avoid tyranny through division rather than conflict. However, the most renowned part of Lycurgus' reforms concerned the education system. While this topic will be explored in detail in the next section, it is crucial to understand that Lycurgus perceived the entire state as a single, immense camp. A Spartan did not belong to himself, he was an integral part of the whole, a cog in a complex machine where every step was prescribed, and every choice was predetermined. The renunciation of private life and emphasized restraint became distinguishing features of the ideal citizen. What did the Spartans themselves think of their state? They deeply believed that their system was not merely wise, but sacred. After Lycurgus completed his reforms, he left Sparta and, according to legend, voluntarily starved himself to death so as never to violate the laws he had established. Before leaving, he made his fellow citizens swear an oath not to change anything until his return. He never returned, and therefore, the laws were considered eternal. The image of the ideal state, in the Spartans' view, was built not on the idea of freedom, as in Athens, but on the idea of order. They considered themselves not heroes of tragedies and philosophers, but heirs of Heracles, those who cleanse the world of chaos and bring law. Their lives needed no embellishment, their speech no elegance, their history no monuments. They themselves were living monuments. Two kings, one law, thousands of voices, all sounding in unison. Thus began Sparta, not as a city, but as a dogma, as an image casting a shadow over all of Greece. It was not merely a power, it was a system. And in this system, there was no place for the weak. The life of a Spartan did not begin with a mother's embrace, but with a harsh test. When an infant was born, its mother did not wrap it in soft swaddling clothes or hold it forever to her breast. She merely held it until the elders arrived. There were 5 of them. They alone decided whether the child was worthy to live. They carefully examined the infant, checking for visible deformities, signs of weakness, or illness. If the child seemed unviable, no warm home or friendly environment awaited it, it was carried to the foot of Mount Taygetus and cast into a chasm. Thus began the Spartan system, without pity and without exceptions. If the child was deemed strong, it was returned to its mother. But not for long, until the age of 7, boys lived at home, and only outwardly did this resemble a normal childhood. Even then, preparation began, cold baths, coarse food, training in silence, restraint, and self-control. Boys were not told fairy tales, they were instilled with stories of valor. At 7 years old, a boy left his parents' home and entered the agoge, a state education system unparalleled in all of Hellas. From that moment, he ceased to belong to his family. Now his father was Sparta. The agoge lasted until the age of 20. These were years filled with pain, fear, humiliation, and cruelty, but all of it was considered an integral part of the process. Boys were divided into squads, each with a senior appointed, who also served as the primary overseer. He punished, monitored, and humiliated, not out of malice, but out of duty. They lived in barracks, slept on reed mats they cut themselves by the river, without a knife, with bare hands. They ate 1 meal a day, a black broth made of blood, vinegar, and salted meat. Those who desired more had to steal, but without being caught. For if a boy was caught, he was punished not for theft, but for carelessness. Beatings were the norm. They were administered for transgressions, for showing weakness, for insufficient resilience, sometimes without apparent reason, simply as a test of character. One story, preserved in Plutarch's writings, tells of a boy who stole a fox cub and hid it under his tunic. When the overseer approached, he stood motionless. The fox cub tore at his belly, but the boy did not utter a sound. However, the agoge was not solely about suffering. Boys were taught military skills, gymnastics, singing, and even basic literacy. They learned laconicism, the art of speaking briefly and precisely. One Spartan, after listening to a long tirade from an Athenian, replied, "If you were a Lacedaemonian, you would have already fallen silent." Silence was a virtue, words were weapons, and foolishness was a sin. At 18, boys entered the next stage, the cryptia. This was a secret ritual, a kind of initiation. Selected youths were sent into the fields, where they lived in complete solitude and were to monitor the helots. Their task was to instill fear, sometimes to kill. No one asked how many you killed, they asked if you remained unnoticed. At 20, they became men, but even then, they could not live with their wives, this was permitted only after 30. Before that, service, communal meals, barracks, constant training. Even after marrying, a Spartan had to sneak to his wife at night and leave before dawn. Thus, Sparta maintained a spirit of severity even in love. But it was not only young men who underwent trials. Girls were also educated in Sparta. They received serious physical training, running, wrestling, discus throwing, and armed dances. This was not for participation in wars, but for the purpose of bearing healthy children. A woman had to be strong, straightforward, and capable of enduring pain. She did not wear veils or stay confined indoors. She spoke aloud and looked people in the eye. They were not considered their husband's property. In the absence of men, they managed households, sometimes entire villages. They had their own pride, their own language. When a Persian envoy asked why women in Sparta wielded such power, he was told, "Because only we give birth to men." Marriage was not a matter of love, but a state affair. Young people were united not by feeling, but by calculation. The main goal was to produce a worthy Spartan. If one husband was weak, the state could allow the wife to conceive with another. Everything that served the purpose of survival was permissible. Thus, a nation unlike any other was born, not from the blood of heroes, but from constant selection. Spartans were not born, they became so through pain, obedience, and pride. In this system, there was no room for pity, but there was room for strength. And it was thanks to this strength that Sparta would soon make its presence known throughout Hellas. When we envision Sparta, the first image that comes to mind is its army, neat ranks, red cloaks, bronze helmets with characteristic crests, shields adorned with the letter L, the symbol of Lacedaemon. However, behind this outward grandeur lay more than just military might. It was underpinned by a complex social structure in which absolutely everything, from daily rations to intimate relationships, was subordinated to a single, all-encompassing goal, to be ready for war. Every Spartan was a hoplite, a heavily armed infantryman who formed the backbone of the invincible phalanx. His armament was simple but, in the hands of a trained warrior, it became formidable, a round bronze shield, intended not so much for personal protection as for covering a neighbor, a long spear with a heavy tip, a short, almost toy-like sword, used only when the formation broke and the fight devolved into close combat. The Spartan's primary weapon was discipline. In the phalanx, there was no room for individual heroism. If a warrior stepped forward, he exposed his comrade; if he retreated, he broke the formation. Victory went not to the physically strongest, but to the one who impeccably held the line. Spartans did not approve of those who stood out, they valued those who were like everyone else, perfectly precise and reliable. Training never ceased, even adult warriors continued constant drills. They wore no adornments, did not shave their beards, ate the same food, and lived in equally modest conditions. This was not a punishment, it was an ideal. On the battlefield, Spartans moved in complete silence, without shouts, without commotion. Only the sound of footsteps, only the movement of shields, could be heard. Opponents were gripped by panic at their mere approach, often, enemies fled before the battle even began. But if combat did commence, Sparta acted ruthlessly. No songs of praise were sung for the defeated. At the core of this system lay a brutal simplicity. However, it relied not only on warriors. Around and beneath them existed other social strata. The most numerous and most unfortunate were the helots. Helots were not merely slaves, they constituted a distinct class, somewhere between freedom and complete subjugation. Their ancestors had been captured in Laconia and Messenia during bloody, multi-year wars. They cultivated the land, worked in Spartan homes, and paid a tax in produce, which was enough for the Spartans to live on. Without them, the system would have collapsed, yet they had no rights whatsoever. They could be killed without explanation. They were regularly humiliated so they would not forget their place. Each year, the ephors, Sparta's elected magistrates, declared a symbolic war on the helots. This meant that any Spartan could kill a helot, and it was not considered a crime. Young warriors underwent the krypteia, a clandestine hunt for slaves, to instill fear in them. And yet, despite constant terror, the helots did not disappear. They rebelled, they endured, they survived, and ultimately played a significant role in Sparta's fall. But not only men and helots shaped the polis. Women and elders held a special place in society. As noted earlier, women were relatively free and strong. They managed the household while men fought, they raised future warriors, and they were respected and sometimes even feared. There is a famous account of a mother who, upon learning that her son had fled the battlefield, drove him away in disgrace, throwing in his face, "Either with your shield or on it." The elders were not superannuated warriors, but guardians of the law. The Gerousia, the Council of Elders, comprised men over 60 years old. They were elected by the people, but voting was not by counting ballots, but by the strength of shouts, who cheered the candidate the loudest. These men resolved legal disputes, discussed matters of war and peace, and could even overturn the decisions of kings. Their opinions were heated. Thus, Sparta was not merely an army, it was a complex mechanism. Helots provided food, women bore children, elders judged, youths trained, warriors fought. Everyone knew their place. This system had little flexibility but great strength. It was built on fear and pride, on discipline and the unwavering idea that honor was more important than life. And if anyone thought these were just fine words, history once put everything in its place. This happened long before the Peloponnesian War, when a threat loomed over Hellas, beside which internal strife seemed like trivial dust. The Persian king Xerxes led an army westward, such as Greece had never seen, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, a mighty fleet, vast supply trains, countless slaves. An entire empire moved against the fragmented polis. It was then that the Greeks decided to hold the Persians at the only place where a narrow pass between mountains and sea prevented the use of numerical superiority. This pass was called Thermopylae, or Hot Gates. Here, on the border of northern Greece, it was decided to delay Xerxes. The Spartan king Leonidas stood at the head of the contingents. According to tradition, he selected 300 warriors, only those who already had sons capable of continuing the lineage. He knew that no one would return. He did not seek victory, he sought to buy time. In total, about 7,000 Greeks were in the pass, but it was the Spartans who stood in the center, unshakably holding the line. For 3 days, they held back the onslaught. Persian detachments came in waves, but the phalanx did not waver. The Spartans fought silently, coolly, in the same order as they had trained. Shields interlocked, spears struck accurately. Dead Persians lay before a wall of bodies, but the waves continued. On the third day, Xerxes learned of a secret path that could bypass the pass. When Leonidas realized the path was cut off, he dismissed his allies. Only 300 Spartans, 700 Thespians, and a small number of Thebans remained. They knew what awaited them. The last battle was without calculation, without hope. Spears broke, the fight was hand-to-hand until the last man fell. When it was all over, heaps of bodies lay on the ground, and Leonidas himself perished, not retreating a single step. This battle did not decide the outcome of the war, but it became an enduring legend. It gave the Greeks time, it gave them an example, it gave future generations a symbol that duty could be higher than life, and death, not defeat, but proof of resilience. In Sparta, on a hill, an inscription remained, preserved by the stones, "Go tell the Spartans, passerby, that here by Spartan law we lie." Ancient Hellas was never a single state. It resembled more a multicolored tapestry woven from countless independent city-states, each with its own system of government, its own gods, and its unique customs. However, among them, two centers stood out, two antagonistic forces that seemed to embody two diametrically opposed views on the very essence of human existence, Sparta and Athens. Sparta lived in strict accordance with the principles of austerity, order, and comprehensive control. Athens, with freedom, words, and the unrestrained movement of thought. One polis raised unquestioning warriors, the other, citizens who questioned endlessly. One culture taught patience, the other, eloquence. They were too different to coexist peacefully for long. Yet, for a considerable time, their alliance was mutually beneficial, especially during the war with Persia, where the Spartan army and the Athenian fleet jointly defended the Greek world from the threat from the east. But when the common cause was completed, their paths diverged. Athens became the center of the Delian League, a formal alliance created to protect Hellas, which soon transformed into an instrument of domination. The city on the hills built its empire not through conquest, but through contributions, political pressure, and naval power. Athens levied tribute on allies, suppressed discontent, and increasingly behaved like a powerful sovereign rather than an equal partner. Sparta watched this with growing irritation. In its eyes, Athens was a source of disorder, an arrogant democratic force that was destroying centuries-old foundations. For Sparta, order was not just an ideal, it was a means of survival. To disrupt this order meant to undermine the very fabric of Spartan life. When some polis began to ask Sparta for protection from Athenian pressure, Sparta decided to intervene. Thus began the Peloponnesian War, a conflict that engulfed all of Hellas for decades. Sparta held superiority on land. Its army, disciplined from childhood, knew no fear. The warriors maintained a phalanx, a compact formation where each protected his neighbor, not himself. Their shields carried not just bronze, but the honor of the city. Battles involving them were extremely restrained, almost cold, without grand speeches or emotional gestures. Their goal was not glory, their goal was the flawless execution of duty. The Athenians dominated the sea. Their triremes, light and fast ships, patrolled the Aegean Sea, transported grain, controlled trade, and allowed Athens to survive even when the enemy army stood at the city gates. Their strategy was different, not to engage the enemy in a decisive land battle, to defend behind the long walls, and slowly wear down the opponent. The first years of the war brought Sparta tactical successes. Their troops devastated fields in Attica, destroyed settlements, and forced the Athenians to hide behind their walls. But it was behind these walls that disaster struck. Overpopulation, unsanitary conditions, and crowding caused an epidemic. A plague swept through the city, claiming tens of thousands of lives. Among the dead was Pericles, the man who had long kept the city from madness, a symbol of Athenian restraint and greatness. His death became a turning point, and Athens began to change. The war continued. And although both sides occasionally concluded truces, a lasting peace was not established. Athens carried out naval raids, attacked Sparta's allies, and instigated revolts in Messenian villages. The Spartans responded with invasions and support for oligarchic coups. Every summer brought new raids, every year, new casualties. But neither side could deliver a decisive blow. Among the outstanding personalities of those years, two stand out, Brasidas and Alcibiades. Brasidas, a Spartan, was not only a warrior but also a talented diplomat. He knew how to persuade cities without using force, winning their sympathies with his speeches and honesty. He was almost Athenian in his intellect and manner of speaking, but remained Spartan in spirit. His death in battle with Cleon, the Athenian strategist, demagogue, and enemy of the aristocracy, was symbolic. Both perished, and both left a void. Meanwhile, Athens was preparing a new strike, the expedition to Sicily. It was planned as a brilliant expansion of influence, the capture of Syracuse, control over the western Mediterranean, new trade, new glory. At its head stood Alcibiades, handsome, intelligent, audacious, a student of Socrates, and a darling of the people. But his fate became a whimsical reflection of Athenian flexibility and instability. Accused of impiety, Alcibiades fled and offered his services to Sparta. He knew everything about Athenian plans. Thanks to his advice, Sparta strengthened its position, and the Sicilian expedition turned into a disaster. The fleet was destroyed, the army captured, the survivors died in stone quarries. Athens lost everything, people, ships, hope, yet it continued to fight. Sparta, receiving aid from Persia, began building a fleet. For the first time in its history, it was mastering the sea. Lysander, an ambitious and intelligent commander, became the architect of its new naval power. He conquered not by battle, but by agreements, obtaining money, hiring sailors, and placing allies. At the Battle of Aegospotami in the early 5th century BC, he suddenly attacked the Athenian fleet at anchor and destroyed it almost without a fight. This was the final blow. Left without ships, without provisions, without foreign trade, Athens capitulated. When the Spartans entered the city, there were no celebrations, no triumphal processions. They silently tore down the walls, destroyed democracy, and installed their governors, the 30 tyrants. But Sparta did not know what to do with victory. It knew how to fight, but not how to govern. The governors proved cruel. The Athenians soon rose up, expelled them, and restored the republic. Athens, though bled dry, regained its voice. Its thought did not die, schools operated, theaters staged plays. Democracy, having lost an empire, retained its spirit. And Sparta began to disintegrate. Allies, initially thrilled by the victory, began to hate the new hegemon. Helots, inspired by example, started revolts. Spartans, unaccustomed to governing distant lands, lost control. The old discipline began to crack. Thus ended the great rivalry. Athens and Sparta were exhausted. They were not destroyed, but they ceased to be paramount. Hellas was depleted. On the horizon, a new leader was already rising, Macedon. And soon, the Greeks would be commanded by a king, not a council. But the images remained, Athens as the voice of reason and words, Sparta as the symbol of duty and discipline. They debated how people should live, and even in defeat, they left this debate to us, so that in each generation we might again choose, freedom or order, word or structure, idea or sword. When the Peloponnesian War concluded and Athens was defeated, Sparta found itself at the apex of the Greek world. It became the sole power to which other polis listened, and which they now viewed not as an ally, but as a sovereign. However, victory did not bring it lasting might. The system, meticulously developed for long-term defense and internal restraint, proved unsuitable for governing a vast empire. Sparta did not know how to be a master, it knew how to be a fortress. The equality among citizens was declared as the foundation of its society. So, at least, it was asserted in ideal terms. Every Spartan, called a homoios, received a plot of land, which was cultivated by helots. Everyone had the right to participate in the syssitia, communal military meals that were not merely meals but a daily ritual, binding the warriors together as one. However, by the early 4th century BCE, equality had become a mere illusion. Wealthy citizens gradually bought up land. The poorest citizens lost their plots and, with them, their right to full participation in public life. More and more Spartans became hypomaions, individuals who were formally free but effectively excluded from the military and political system. Concurrently, a problem that Sparta had always preferred to ignore became increasingly acute, the plight of the helots. These slaves, inherited from ancient Messenian wars, constituted the vast majority of the population. They tilled the fields, providing Sparta with food and sustenance, but lived in constant fear, without rights and with a profound sense of helplessness. For many years, they were kept in check by brutal laws, ritualized killings, and an annually declared war that allowed Spartans to kill them without trial. But over time, fear waned, and the Helots began to realize that the number of Spartans was dwindling, that the army was increasingly engaged in foreign campaigns, and that control was weakening. It was then that revolts began to erupt, first subtly, then openly. The situation became particularly dire in Messenia, an ancient and fertile region once forcibly subjugated by Sparta. It was there, where hatred for Sparta ran deepest, that the Helots were the first to take up arms. Their uprisings became more frequent and organized, forcing Sparta to commit forces to suppress them that had previously been used to deter external enemies. This weakened Sparta from within, depleted its resources, caused alarm among its allies, and undermined its authority. Yet, the most severe blow was not the rebellion of the slaves, but the slow disappearance of the Spartan population itself. While Sparta once boasted around 9,000 full citizens, by the mid-3rd century BCE, there were no more than 1,000, and by the 2nd century, only a few hundred. Being born a Spartan was an exceptional matter. One had to be born into the right family, undergo the agoge, possess a plot of land, and pay for participation in the syssitia. All of this became increasingly inaccessible. The laws were strict but no longer effective. The youth failed their trials. The army shrank, the system remained in force, on paper, but in reality, fewer and fewer people belonged to it. Nevertheless, amidst this general decline, Sparta's external glory persisted. City-states continued to formally recognize Sparta's authority until 371 BCE, when something previously unimaginable occurred on the plain of Leuctra. Sparta lost an open battle. They faced the Thebans, led by the talented general Epaminondas. He understood that the Spartan phalanx could not be defeated head-on. Instead of a uniform front, he concentrated his striking force on the left flank, arraying his infantry in a deep column 50 ranks deep. This allowed him to deliver a powerful blow to the center of the Spartan formation, where their best warriors were positioned. King Cleombrotus himself fell in battle, and the phalanx faltered and disintegrated. This was not merely a military defeat but the collapse of the image of an invincible Sparta. Hellas saw that the myth could be shattered, and the Spartans defeated. The consequences were devastating. Soon, the Thebans liberated Messenia and helped the Helots found the new city of Messene, with strong walls, an independent army, and its own governance. Those who had for centuries worked Spartan land now lived freely upon it. The blow was not only military but symbolic. A state founded on subjugation lost its foundation. The Helots departed, the land was left without laborers. The old order was shattered. Yet, even after this, Sparta did not revise its system. It continued to cling to ancient norms, even when it became clear that they no longer worked. Society decayed, but no one dared to change its essence, out of fear, out of pride, out of a belief that they simply needed to endure. And so it continued until a man emerged who resolved to do the impossible. Cleomenes III, who came to power at the end of the 3rd century BCE, was one of the last Spartan kings to attempt to restore the city's strength. He understood that the decline could only be halted by radical methods and began reforms. He abolished debts, redistributed land, expanded the number of citizens, reinstated the agoge, and restored participation in the syssitia. He wanted not just to reform Sparta, but to revive it, to breathe the spirit of its ancestors back into it. However, his reforms met with resistance both within and outside Laconia. The Achaean League, and then Macedon, opposed him. In 222 BCE, at the Battle of Sellasia, Cleomenes' army was crushed. He fled to Egypt, where he soon committed suicide. With his death, the last serious attempt to restore Sparta's greatness also died. In the following centuries, it gradually disappeared from the political map. It was not conquered in battle or destroyed, it simply became increasingly insignificant. The city remained, its dwellings stood, and people continued to call themselves Spartans. But what made this polis unique vanished. By the Hellenistic era, it was merely a shadow of its former self. When the Romans arrived, they were more interested not in what Sparta was, but in what had been written about it. The Romans admired its austerity. They liked the image of the silent warrior, the ideal citizen, the iron discipline. They studied it as an ancient phenomenon, but Sparta itself was no longer strong or independent. It had become a living museum, a place where, even today, when something is referred to as Spartan, it invariably evokes notions of strictness, asceticism, and remarkable restraint. Spartan living has become synonymous with an existence devoid of excess, and Spartan upbringing, a benchmark of harsh but effective discipline. Generations continue to repeat legendary sayings, "With your shield, or on it." The phrase, "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie," is also deeply ingrained in humanity's memory. This enduring legacy is truly astonishing, considering the ancient Greek world boasted numerous other city-states. These city-states often surpassed Sparta in material wealth, intellectual development, and political influence. Yet, it was Sparta that managed to embed itself in the collective memory not merely as a geographical point or a political entity, but as an unshakable idea. Its existence was not guaranteed by strong walls, nor secured by the might of its armies, nor prolonged by numerous descendants. Its immortality was ensured by exceptional glory. The glory of people who, at a certain point, chose not excessive luxury, but strict order, not empty words, but decisive actions, not momentary victory, but sacred duty.